I want to start this segment with a question. A pretty simple one at that. Are there too many Magic formats? Now, very obviously, this is an opinion question. But is it valid? I mean, there is quite a lot to keep up with in Magic, to the point where not all the ban lists are even made by Wizards of the Coast. I know the Commander ban list, which is a little bit weird to think about, isn't even run in-house. I mean, we have so many cards available. It's probably up to 20,000 by now at the time of recording. But how do you divide them into these categories? I mean, we have Vintage and the other Eternal format. We have Block Constructed, which is now defunct. We had Extended. Standard is pretty obvious, except Standard's not obvious because rotation is weird and off-center. We have Modern. Commander's weird, as the aforementioned off-topic ban list, but also Commander is singleton and still needs a ban list. Mana's easy to get. Mana rocks are highly available. Soul rings in the game. There's a lot of tutoring in Commander. There's a lot of different answers. Commander's weird. I'm not sure that I'm the person to assert that there are too many formats. Although the partner format, Two-Headed Giant, and Brawl, and other standard-based formats are competing. We also have Draft, and Sealed, and Chaos Drafts, all sorts of different things at pre-release. I'm not one to say that there is a definitive existence of too many formats, but I do want to make a note that the formats are contributing to cannibalizing the design space and specifically cards in the new sets. Now, we have had quite a lot of bans, very frequently in Standard, and it's something that I can't help but notice. Cards are reprinted, and of course that means that cards get shifted in rarity, affecting formats like Pauper, for instance. Cards are introduced to new sets, especially cards like Modern Horizons, introducing cards into the Modern format. And obviously you have the injection of cards from Standard, which occasionally makes its way into older formats, with reprints going to reprints like Pithing Needle, for example, being in Standard and not generally affecting the game, being a pretty big dud in some draft pools, for instance, but seeing a little bit of sideboard construction. Is it the design space is just too difficult in Modern Magic? Not in the Modern sets particularly, although they are included. How we have this space where a product needs to do this and this and this and this. It needs to be balanced for Sealed, so it has to have the right color fixing. It has to have the right archetypes so that it is independent and can be drafted in its respective block. It needs to have cards which link up to other decks. It needs to have money cards, not just for Standard formats. Don't just reprint the lands again and again and again. You need to have new cards which become staples. You need to address problems as they fit into other cards. You need to have those Modern plants, those Vintage, those Legacy plants. And it's just unstable and unfocused when we have it. Standard itself is pretty weak, and the cards rotate out, and 90% of them will never see play in Modern or Extended or any other format after their Standard rotation. They're pretty worthless, and that's bad design. I think the big problem is the sets aren't focused. There's too many things pulling them. I think there's very obviously different cards that are too powerful for Standard, which have been printed, probably as plants. We got Paradox Engine, which is dumb. We have the entire Energy Mechanic, which had to be scrapped because it was just too powerful. We have a whole bunch of proliferate cards coming into standard. That's scary, especially because we might have more -1/-1 counters or +1/+1 counters. I'm glad that didn't work with energy at the time, because that would have been terrible. But we have a legacy in standard that is just useless or overpowered, and that polarization isn't good. We have the planeswalkers, which are really, really strong and warp the game in themselves. I'm probably going to do a Menace series entry just on planeswalkers, because they have so much initiative and they can do 3 things, and one of the things is usually win the game. But you don't always have to get to that point, and there's just so much pressure. It forces you to make attacks immediately, and you might be in a board stall and then be forced to remove their planeswalker. Your kill spells don't always work all around them. It's just the structure of the game. Standard is a mess. And I wonder if there should be more injections into older formats. Should there be a direct redress to some of the problems in Vintage or Legacy, for instance, in the manner of counterplay options? Should there be like a hand trap equivalent to disrupt your opponent's turn 1 combo that's specific to Legacy and Vintage? I know we have Force of Will, but a Force of Will that's not so polarizing. Force of Will can lose you the game. It's a good question, because we had a modern injection. Obviously, you can't reprint cards off of the restricted list. That's a problem in itself. But could you reprint new cards specifically for old formats? Could you go back to Kamigawa and add a few cards to make Kamigawa block constructed better? That's a question that I want to pose. I don't know. It's probably not practical. Could you imagine a set that has 4 cards for Kamigawa, 4 cards for Eldritch Moon for Innistrad, 4 cards for Ravnica, and each card slots into its respective plane to make an interesting constructed experience when you take those additional cards and slot them into your deck? A mixed format set like that probably will never get off the ground, but it'd be interesting. I think your design space is just too difficult, that you're managing this and that and the other thing, and you're often missing things. Cards just slot into Pauper, and they're too powerful. Cards just fit into modern decks, and suddenly you have Eldrazi Winter. And the Eldrazi are just too strong. Not necessarily Emrakul. Emrakul was never the problem. But it still got banned in Standard. We have all these problems. Aetherworks Marvel was the problem in that case. But should we be designing sets that are disposable, but filled with a few particularly good cards? Our fetch lands? Our Aetherworks Marvels? Our energy as a mechanic? I just don't think it's good for the longevity of the game to reduce Standard to a blip and the most inexpensive format having to chase expensive cards, especially in the land base. I think that's the most egregious offense, is every few years we get new lands that are really powerful. Not like the Legacy lands, not Tron, but really strong dual or triple lands, and it just causes the price to go up. Are these plants in Standard good for the game? No. Is it supporting strategies that aren't good for the game? Yes. So maybe the question isn't, are there too many formats in Magic? But it does lead us to a better question, and is that, should Magic be designed for multiple formats in each set? And I don't know the answer. I don't know if there's practical sense, because you have the problem of splitting your demographic, because some players only play Standard and they're okay with their cards rotating out. And that's a little frightening for some people, but you spent $20 or $50 or maybe even hundreds of dollars on these cards, and then you can't use them in the future? It's a hobby. You shouldn't be trying to make money. You shouldn't expect the money that you put into the game to ever bring more or even the same amount of money back to you. You're lucky if you can break even. Most of the time, you're playing the game at a big loss. But that's the nature of set rotation. I don't know. I don't know if there is ever going to be an answer. Old Yu-Gi-Oh cards occasionally spike in value, especially with the introduction of new mechanics. And that just doesn't happen with standard legal Magic cards. Not in general. Occasionally, there is something. Should there be focus on more sets, or does it not make economic sense to split your demographic like that? I think that's the point of evaluation that's going to be in the future.